What would you do when your escape route is completely cut off by an enemy twice your size? What happens when one flank is the sea, the other is a sheer mountain wall, and standing right in front of you are 100,000 of the finest warriors of the world's largest empire, waiting to swallow you whole? According to every conventional military rule, you are already dead. At the Battle of Issus, King Darius III of Persia was absolutely certain of this. He made a fatal move, marching his massive army around the rear and personally setting up the ultimate perfect trap to imprison the Macedonian army. But history records this as one of the most brutal and insane lessons of ancient warfare. Why did a flawless trap become the graveyard of its creator? Why was absolute numerical superiority suffocated and turned into a dagger plunged right back into the heart of the Persian Empire? How did Alexander the Great turn a desperate dead end into the greatest breakthrough of his life? Forget about simple hand-to-hand combat. This video will decode a crazy paradox of war. A trap only really works if the one setting it knows exactly what kind of monster they're locking inside. In 334 BC, the 21-year-old Alexander led the Macedonian war machine across the Hellespont, knocking on the door of the world's most powerful empire. At the Battle of the Granicus River, he shattered Persia's first line of defense. But that victory was just child's play. The door was open, but the blade of death was still pressing against Alexander's throat. The Persian Empire possessed a massive naval fleet, dominating the entire eastern Mediterranean. If Alexander simply charged blindly inland, this fleet could easily cut off his entire supply and communication line back to Greece. The invincible Macedonian army would starve and wither in the desert without Persia having to fire a single arrow. So, how does an infantry army with no strong navy defeat a colossal fleet? Alexander's answer proved he was not just a reckless warrior, but a genius of strategic manipulation. He didn't choose to confront the enemy where they were strongest. Instead of taking ships out to sea, he decided to choke the Persian navy from the land. His solution was ruthless and absolute, sweeping along the coast and stripping away all of the enemy's naval bases, starting with Miletus and then Halicarnassus. Alexander didn't sink enemy ships, he simply wiped out their safe havens, leaving them nowhere to dock and resupply. Persia, of course, did not sit idly by. They played an incredibly dangerous card. Memnon of Rhodes, a cold-blooded Greek mercenary general serving Persia. Memnon understood Alexander's weakness exactly. He immediately led Persian warships across the Aegean, capturing the islands of Chios and Lesbos, threatening to bring the flames of war right back to the Greek homeland. If Memnon succeeded, Alexander would be forced to turn back. But history always favors the conquerors. Right when the plan was working perfectly, Memnon suddenly died of illness. Memnon's passing caused Persia's entire counteroffensive effort to collapse. Alexander gained precious time, and the great king Darius III had just lost his most dangerous military mind. Persia, of course, did not sit idly by. They played an incredibly dangerous card. Memnon of Rhodes, a cold-blooded Greek mercenary general serving Persia. Memnon understood Alexander's weakness exactly. He immediately led Persian warships across the Aegean, capturing the islands of Chios and Lesbos, threatening to bring the flames of war right back to the Greek homeland. If Memnon succeeded, Alexander would be forced to turn back. But history always favors the conquerors. Right when the plan was working perfectly, Memnon suddenly died of illness. Memnon's passing caused Persia's entire counteroffensive effort to collapse. Alexander gained precious time, and the great king Darius III had just lost his most dangerous military mind. Darius was convinced he had checkmated the young king, but the Persian king never realized that trapping Alexander in a narrow funnel like Issus was the worst geographical mistake of his entire life. How did this battle of spatial manipulation begin? Darius arrived at Issus bringing everything a great king could desire, a colossal army of up to 100,000 men, the infamous Immortals' vanguard, and the finest cavalry forces in the world. On paper, this army was more than capable of crushing anyone who dared to stand in its way. However, the very desire to checkmate and capture Alexander caused Darius to make the worst geographical blunder in military history. By cutting off Alexander's rear at Issus, Darius deliberately chose a battlefield only 6 miles wide, tightly squeezed between the sea and steep mountain cliffs. Cramming 100,000 troops into this funnel was like trying to stuff a giant elephant into a narrow alleyway. In such a confined space, Persia's overwhelming numerical advantage was instantly neutralized, as they had absolutely no room to spread their formation and envelop the enemy. At Issus, the question of who has more men was thrown in the trash. This battle now became a brutal playground of who has the superior spatial vision. Fully aware of the narrow terrain, Darius tried to salvage the situation by massing all of his finest cavalry on his right wing, hugging the sea, the only ground flat enough for a cavalry sweep. His most battle-hardened Greek mercenaries held the very center, and Persian infantry filled the left wing. Then the Persian king held his position behind the small Granicus River, confidently waiting for the prey to run head-first into the net. Alexander glanced at the battlefield and instantly read his opponent's intentions. He deployed his troops not to defend, but to pre-select exactly where he would deliver the killing blow. The left wing by the sea he entrusted to the veteran Parmenion to hold at all costs. In the center stood the familiar meat grinder of phalanx infantry, and Alexander himself, he gathered all the most elite units, the Agrinian javelin throwers, archers, hypastists, and the legendary Companion Cavalry, shifting them all to the right wing, hugging the mountain slopes. And this was the moment that truly showcased Alexander's monstrous mind. Right as the formations of both sides took shape, Alexander acutely noticed that the massive Persian cavalry block was putting terrifying pressure on Parmenion's left wing. Without panicking, without hesitation, he immediately ordered the Thessalian cavalry to ride across the battlefield to urgently reinforce the left wing. This detail is extremely crucial. It proves Alexander possessed more than just the recklessness of a frontline warrior king. He was a cold-blooded grandmaster rereading the chessboard and adjusting every move even before the battle horn sounded. The targets were locked. An enemy twice their size stood waiting across the river. The silence was spine-chilling until Alexander's battle cry tore through the air. But what awaited Macedonia ahead was not just glory, but the brink of a disaster that could kill their entire empire. How did the breathless events unfold? The battle did not begin with timid probes. As soon as the battle horns roared, Alexander personally led the right wing, delivering a thunderous strike straight into the Persians. The terrifying speed and shock of this charge immediately drove the enemy back. But right in the middle of the battlefield, a catastrophic disaster was taking shape. The invincible Macedonian phalanx, their proudest meat grinder, was on the verge of collapse. Why? Because in a desperate attempt to keep up with Alexander's blistering pace of advance, the phalanx formation had become stretched and disorganized. Darius's Greek mercenaries, the toughest and most seasoned fighters, instantly smelled blood. They smashed into that gap and began driving back the Macedonian center. This was the fragile line between a god of war and an impulsive fool. If the center broke, the Macedonian formation would be chopped in half. At that moment, Alexander's brilliant raid on the right wing would instantly turn into a suicidal charge. He would be isolated, surrounded, and completely crushed. In that life-or-death instant, most generals would be blinded by bloodlust and continue plunging forward, but not Alexander. Witnessing the dying center, Alexander immediately abandoned his blind pursuit of glory on the right wing. He rallied the Companion Cavalry, pivoted 90 degrees, and unleashed a fatal flanking strike, driving straight into the formation of the Greek mercenaries in the Persian center. Struck by a giant, unexpected dagger to their flank, the Greek mercenaries instantly fell into panic and their formation fell apart. The suffocating pressure was broken. The Macedonian phalanx was resurrected, reformed their lines, and relentlessly pushed forward once again. In other words, Alexander didn't win simply because he was braver than his enemy. He won because in that exact fateful split second, he recognized precisely where the fatal weak point was that would decide the fate of the entire war. The flanking stab resolved the crisis in the center. Now there were no more obstacles ahead. Alexander focused all his attention and his blood-soaked gaze on the ultimate prize. He cleared the path, slashing madly to close in straight on the royal chariot, where the great king Darius III was standing. Macedonia's greatest apex predator was face to face with the king of Asia. When Alexander's spearhead and the Companion Cavalry were only a few steps away from the king of Asia, a humiliating truth was exposed. Facing a fearless god of war, Darius III completely crumbled. Instead of standing his ground to fight and defend his crown, he abandoned his army, turned his royal chariot around, and fled for his life from the battlefield. This wasn't just a shameful retreat. For a colossal empire like Persia, the presence of the great king was the central nervous axis of the entire army. When Darius turned his back and ran, that nervous axis was severed. The battle crumbled on its own. Yet, on the other side of the battlefield, disaster was still threatening to rain down on the Macedonians. The veteran general Parmenion was locked in a desperate struggle against the terrifying pressure of the finest Persian cavalry. If this left wing broke before the Persian center collapsed, Alexander could still lose everything. The Persians could swing around the rear and snatch victory straight from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his soldiers gritted their teeth and held the line fiercely. And then, when the news of Darius's flight spread, the fighting will of the Persian army was entirely extinguished. They dropped their weapons and trampled over each other to save their own lives. The battle officially turned into a bloodbath of epic proportions. General Ptolemy later recounted that the Persian dead were piled so high that the Macedonians used their corpses to fill a deep ravine just across it. The Battle of Issus was not just a military victory, it was a seismic event that stripped Persia of everything. Alexander didn't just capture the battlefield, he captured Darius's entire family alive, from his mother and wife to his children. The Macedonian war machine continued to crush the western part of the empire. The coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted, completely stripping Persia of its naval power from the mainland. The stubborn island city of Tyre was flattened after a terrifying 7-month siege using a causeway and massive siege towers. Gaza fell. Egypt fell to its knees, handing over its entire treasury and crowning Alexander as pharaoh without shedding a drop of blood. By this time, Darius III, in absolute desperation, sent a letter seeking peace. He promised to give Alexander a fortune in gold, his daughter's hand in marriage, and half of his colossal empire in exchange for peace. Any other king would have nodded at this historic bargain, but not Alexander. The letter was flatly rejected because his magnificent victories convinced the young king he didn't come here to take half an empire, he came to take it all. The Battle of Issus proved a brutal truth. Darius could be defeated even when he was the one choosing the time, the place, and possessing overwhelming numbers. From that day forward, Alexander was no longer just a border raider. He was officially an empire-level threat. The man who would devour the entire ancient world.
And that is how Alexander the Great choked a fleet from the land, manipulated a perfect trap, and tore out the heart of the Persian Empire at the Battle of Issus. What impressed you most, Alexander's tactical vision or King Darius's cowardice? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next epic tactical breakdowns. See you next time.